Okay, so here we are at a little over 90 degrees, adding the rennet to the milk, which had the citric acid already in it. The rennet is going to be stirred in really well, and we give it some time to coagulate, about 3 to 5 minutes. I'm going to check for a clean break, so you can use a knife, you could use your finger. Just make sure that milk is now coagulated, and we're going to cut the curd. So a nice long knife is good for this. Just want to make even slices as best you can, maybe 1/2 inch wide or so. Eventually you want to cut this up into small cubes. So you can see we go vertically one way and then horizontally the other, and that's going to give you some nice thin columns. And once the columns have been made, you can go diagonally and sideways, and just want to cut them into small chunks, and then we're going to heat them so that some of the whey comes out of the curd. So you're separating the curds from the whey. And the smaller those curds are, the faster they will have the whey cooked out of them. So you can kind of use your judgment on how small you want them to be, what your temperature is on the stove. But we're just making sure we get any big globs broken down a little bit. And you can see the curds that are on the bottom of the pan on the heat have already started to cook and stretch and melt. So it might have been a good idea to take it off the heat for that part. But basically you're gonna make sure they're cut, heat them up a little bit. And you can see the curds are starting to mat together, which is a good sign after about 10 minutes. We're gonna keep heating until we get to around 110 degrees, and then remove our curds from the whey. If you leave them in the whey, they can acidify because there's still citric acid in there and there's still lactic acid in there. And the longer you leave it in there, the more acidic your curds will get. And that can lead to problems stretching if their pH changes too much. So we'll take them out. Some people use water at this point, so they may have had a pot of water heating up to the correct temperature, and then they could just go right to that step next. But I figure my whey is already there, and I'm already heating it, so I may as well just use that for the next step. All right, so now our whey has been heated up to at least 160 degrees, but we don't really want it to be too high. So I usually like it around 160 to 170. Turn that heat way down so it doesn't continue to get too hot. And you can see I've taken the curds and broken that into 2 balls. So as they were sitting in the strainer, they were dripping whey into a bowl that was underneath it, and they're continuing to mat together over there. So I just took my hands and broke it into 2 balls, and then we're gonna put those curds into the whey as you saw and start heating them up. And we want those curds to get to an internal temperature of about 135 degrees to stretch properly. Once you get a feel for what that looks like, you won't have to measure the temperature. You can just kind of tell it's at the right point for stretching. It's also a little hard to measure because it's melty and your thermometer is squishing through into the whey and then it's out of the whey too long, and you have to get a quick read and then use your judgment. So that looks pretty good. We're close to the stretching point here. If you leave it on the bottom of the pot unattended, you can see it's already dripping and melting through the slotted spoon. So that bottom is getting a little too hot, but I wanted the top to get a little warmer before we stretch that glob. So we're just about there. It's hard to get it even. Try to keep it from melting over the sides. You don't want to work it too much. The more you try to stretch and squeeze those curds, the tougher it's going to be. So you want a nice, tender, stretchy, melty mozzarella. And we don't want to work with it too much because then you lose some of that elasticity. All right, so there it is, prime stretching. You want to work pretty quickly because it is going to cool off quickly outside of the whey. So we'll take it out and put it on a plate or another surface where you can work with it. Here's the point where you can salt. I had the salt pre-measured, so for a gallon of milk, usually you want around 1.5 teaspoons of salt. And that should be a sea salt or another version of non-iodized salt, mostly because that can affect the flavor of your cheese and also the ability for your acid to work properly. So it's cooling off. I'm going to heat it up again there to make sure that I can stretch that piece of curd and get the salt incorporated. If you don't use salt, you're going to have a really bland cheese that's really not going to have a lot of flavor. It is hard to make sure that you salt properly. I probably, if I wasn't doing this for the camera, would have used a pinch of salt and kind of dispersed it better than the clump there. So once your salt is dispersed and you've stretched it out, you can form it into a ball or pretty much whatever shape you like. It is gonna kind of melt into a flat ball if you just do what I did in that last frame there, which is fine for most things, even if you wanted to just leave it that way and put it in the refrigerator. You could cut it later, or you could shred it later, or you could even put it, in the middle of a serving plate that way. For the second piece, you can see there's some nice stretching there. That's what you're looking for. Again, a little heavy on the salt there. Ideally, you want to try to get it more evenly dispersed and on both sides. For this second piece, I'm going to show you a couple of different options for shapes that you might want to make out of your mozzarella. Ideally with the stretching also, you want to not see any tearing. If your cheese tears, then, it's not quite at the right temperature, the pH is a little bit off. All right, so one of my kids' favorite things is string cheese. And you probably have all had string cheese from the store. This is just mozzarella stretched into a straight line. You can make it any length that you want, which is kind of fun. Sometimes we make ropes of 10-foot long mozzarella strings, and then we cut them. It is a little hard to keep them uniform when they're homemade. but that's part of the attraction. So once you have the shape that you want, put them into salted ice water to help them cool down fast and retain their shape, not to continue melting and getting flat on the surface. If you don't use salt in your ice water bath, the water will suck out your salt and you'll lose a lot of flavor. So make sure that water is fully saturated or has enough salt in it that it's not going to pull out the salt you want to keep. The other thing that's kind of fun to make are little pearls or mozzarella balls, which you have probably had or seen. So you just cut a small piece, roll it in your hands, put it in the salt water, ice water, help it preserve that shape quickly. Those are really good for caprese salad, or you can put them in marinated olive oil and put them on salads. You can really impress your friends if you bring homemade mozzarella balls to a barbecue. And the fun part is when you have just a little bit left, as the cook, you get to have the leftovers. Sometimes if you stretch it too thin too, like you can see I did there, mostly just to show you that it's starting to tear a little, so and that middle section is not quite warm enough. So not ideal for keeping, but great for tasting. You could also adjust your salt level here if you taste it and it seems not quite salty enough. Or if it's too salty, you could also put it in boiling water, maybe not boiling, but hot water to draw some of the salt out and get it to the right amount. So here is our string cheese cooled. You can see it peels perfectly, just like the store-bought string cheese. And kids love that. The mozzarella balls are going to peel also. So once they're cold, they're not going to stretch, but you can heat them back up if you wanted to. So here's a fancy part. If you don't want to waste anything, you can use your leftover whey that you've already heated most of the way to boiling for making ricotta. So we're going to heat that whey up all the way to almost 180, I would say, and add just a little bit more acid. So you already have the citric acid in here, which may be enough if you just heated the whey up to 180 degrees. But I usually add a little bit of white vinegar, so a tablespoon or two, maybe 3 tablespoons at the max, just to encourage anything left, the solids, to separate from the whey. Let it sit at that hot temperature for about 10 minutes. And then strain it. So this can be a little dangerous, pouring really, really hot liquid. And the steam will be really hot. So if you're sensitive, you might want to wear pot holders. You could do it outside, pointed away from you, or just be really careful. So this is like a muslin cloth or a tea towel. You can use cheesecloth, but something really fine, because ricotta that you make from leftover whey, it will have any of the large cheese solids taken out of it already, so the leftover cheese solids will be very, very fine. So you want something that will not allow those fine solids to come through, but does let the whey come through. So you won't get a lot of yield from doing this. If you want a lot of ricotta, I would suggest making it from milk instead of from whey. But this is a nice way to not waste. And then you have a little bit of ricotta you can use for recipes, either cheesecake or lasagna. You can also store it up and Keep it in the freezer until you have a whole bunch for a bigger recipe. So use a rubber spatula or something to pull off all the solids from the sides. And there you go. You have a nice little bit of ricotta that you maybe weren't even expecting.